There, there you go.
There you go. Go for it. Go for it. Tell me a bit about yourself. Last few years, what you've been working on, the most recent projects you've been working on, and kind of start there, and then it'd be good to understand the sort of team sizes you worked on, where you've played a role, what programming languages you're really like. That's where you kind of really accelerate at, all that sort of stuff.
All right. So I'm a core JavaScript engineer. So let's start from there. So I look at myself that way. I don't even look at myself as a front end, though most of my time has been on the front end. But I have about 11 years or so of experience based in Australia. So I'll start from there. Most of my experience is in enterprise, and most recently since 2016 or 2015 with NAB and Medibank, I started on the AEM stack. So that's Adobe Experience Manager. That's CMS, if you've ever heard of Adobe.
It's the product. Yep, I know it. Yep.
You've used the product. So, okay, fine. So, and I've integrated with that stack and their Java backend, and I've added micro front ends on the front end. I've used HTML slightly on the front end. I've integrated with their APIs. I've added Angular, React on top of that, and I've integrated with external data sources as well to bring information in and then render that sort of stuff out. So I have consistent 5 years of experience on the entire Adobe stack. So AEM, Target, a lot of stuff with analytics and big data, that, moving stuff from Adobe Experience Manager, including interactions, over to Adobe Analytics using Launch or DTM and other cloud sources, and adding a bunch of frameworks on top of that. So a lot of my corporate experience is there. Most recently, I've worked on integrations with Sitecore and React when I was working with Lexus late last year. I worked with Google Maps and Lexus's Sitecore implementation and React on top of it for a few months. So they wanted to build out this charging network, integrating multiple APIs, like where you can find electric charge stations and in various points. So depending on your car, you have like a different charging connector, and there were a bunch of API providers that provided that information, integrating that with Lexus's own network, and then integrating that with Google Maps, and then providing like a journey planner that, if you want to go from here to here within a radius there, so that was for their new cars. So that was a very recent project I did, the React on the front end with a custom Node.js backend API implementation, which pulled in that information. So there was a separate service that pulled in all those charger networks, and then on top of Sitecore. Another project that I did was RMIT. RMIT had this orientation website they built on top of Prismic, which is another CMS which provides documents, and we connected those documents and that data on those documents using GraphQL and Node.js to pull that in, and then render it onto the front end using React. And that was built on top of Meteor, and their database was MongoDB. So that was a complete end-to-end project over there again as well. So the idea was you can have events inside an event type document, which has an entire JSON, and they had like 600 live events, which they would like author inside Prismic on their documents. And then we would pull 600 events and paginate those events. So you had lots of data coming in and paginated, and then you'd have like a infinite scroll sort of a thing. So, you'd scroll down, you'd get 10 events with all their information, scroll down, and then you'd have filters for those events as well. So there are lots of, you get all this data paginated, and then you're trying to filter that data and make your array smaller and smaller based on that. So that was an interesting project as well. Again,
and how do you ensure performance on the front end, the quality, the speed of rendering, the performance? What's your approach?
So pagination is obviously the first approach, and we were using GraphQL, which is pretty performant as well. And depending on the use case that you need on the front end, you want to make sure that your initial call, so it's like you segment your APIs as much as possible, right? So your initial call will have the bare minimum information required to render what you need. And then if you want to, render more information for, let's say you have like 100 objects, right? Or 100 documents. You don't want to render everything each document, you want to render the bare minimum of each document so that your initial load is very small. And then, if a user wants to see, more information for a document, you have like, those view more hacks. So, if a document has like name, date, time, and then there's a description, and you can click view more over there, then you can get more data in for that specific document, so
Yep.
that's where pagination and subpagination comes in and stuff like that. So that's
how do you manage your API calls so you're not doing constant calls back to the database to retrieve that information in those
you
scenarios?
can build a cache on the front end. There are some React libraries that allow you to build cache on the front end, so that if you pull that data in the past, it's already with you, and then the React library will just kind of be like, okay, this data is here. So if you reload that page again and load up the cache instead of
Yep.
So that's a pretty simple way of doing it if you don't want to get into more details. So that was another project that I did very recently.
And when you say, Hashim, when you say end to end, you mean you did all of those parts of the solution? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Oh yes, because the project was given off to like a digital agency, so they just build the design, and then they're like, build this, you have 2 months. and they're like, they're like, they don't care about infrastructure, they don't care about backend. They're like, this is this, what do you need? So that's pretty much it.
And would I be right in saying that you because you worked in corporate for 5 or 6 years, then there was a heavy emphasis on infrastructure and scalability and performance over agency?
And a lot of that stuff was taken away from me because in corporates, because there's so many teams, there's so many people in a team, that you'll have like your DevOps people who do infrastructure, you have your backend people who do that, and thus you asked me, Hash, you seem to have a lot more front end experience. Yeah, well, that's kind of where I ended up being, because AEM has a Java backend, right? And I said I was a core JavaScript engineer, so all the JavaScript in AEM would be on the front end. In for the most part, other than the odd end, you put a React with a separate Node.js backend pulling information for specific one-off applications like a calculator or something like that, for example. And that's why I talked about these two projects that are more recent. Like this was an end-to-end project.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, if you think about kind of the project that I'm talking to you about, which is this integration service, where we're connecting, SFTP to SFTP and managing files coming backwards and forwards and processing files, and maybe talk me through, I guess, how you think about solving that kind of problem, I guess, from your side. Like when you approach a problem like that, like what's your approach to solving that kind of problem, I guess? Because
you guys are just doing an API layer, or like a middle layer, and there's no front end application currently. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're just building this capability in the middle, so that later on you add in something on top if you need to, like admin.
Exactly. I mean, we may have that. We may even try and maybe do that as a maturity on that solution, like as the next stage, right? So it'll come quickly after, but or maybe we won't. Maybe we just, I don't know. This is what we've got to figure out. But I think the core requirement is that we need to send and receive files, and we need to process those files, right? So that's kind of,
so I haven't worked on Lambda, so just as an example, on a commercial scale, right? But ideally you just need something from AWS's compute engine and some sort of drop-in page where you can drop in certain files. So you can have like an open public page where you can drop in certain files. And the idea is we can read those files using any Node.js application that uses the reader stream API, and then you can just read the data that's coming in. As long as it's in a certain format, we can parse that data and then pass it off to your backend, which I assume is SQL or NoSQL. I'm not sure.
It's MySQL. Yeah.
MySQL. Okay. Well, then you can pass it to tables based on the connector that you have, and if the data is not of the type that you require, we can have some error handling over there. As far as having multiple users, I think that's more of an infrastructure problem and less of a JavaScript problem itself. If this was Java, then you'd have multi-threading in it, but with JavaScript, I think it's all kind of built in. You can just You just need to make sure that you have a load balancer and you have enough compute engines that can process the number of connections coming in. And similarly, if you're, I assume the infrastructure that connects to your MySQL database, I assume it's AWS RDBS. I think that's the one you're using, or is this a separate?
Couldn't tell you. Not sure. Not above my pay grade.
Okay, that's fine. As I basically AWS, the infrastructure part kind of manages that, the multiple connections coming in and the data streams coming in. As long as you're paying for those tiers in your infrastructure, then that shouldn't be as much of an issue.
Doesn't it become quite costly though, if you build it that way, to be using that compute power?
That is true. It can be costly, which is why I said you can look at Lambda and have those functions doing it. But I've not worked on them commercially, so I can't really say.
Yeah. And assume that none of the files we're getting are in our format. They're always going to be in the client's format. So we always have to process and
you can do that in Node.js. You stream the file itself as long as you know what the format is. So
yeah, of course, we've agreed to that format. Yeah.
So you've agreed to that format. So they'll give you the file in a certain format that you already know, because otherwise, what's the point, right?
And we've already mapped. We've mapped it in a, in our Confluence page, and we understand what we're mapping to and things like that.
Exactly. So if you can do that, then we can write something in Node.js. I assume it's like some sort of Excel document.
It'll be it could be JSON, it could be XLS, CSV.
As long as it's one of those formats and not just a string-based text file, then we can map headers or with something, and then those values. As long as I can generate key value pairs, it shouldn't be an issue, right? Yeah. So then you can do your cross mapping based on Confluence.
And how about this? How about the sending and receiving of the files? Like building the process to manage sending of a file based on an event trigger, and then receiving, retrieving a file from an SFTP.
So the way you could do that is you'd have to run like some sort of job that checks if that SFTP has a new file, and run that job once. You could run that, a certain number of times a day, or once every day. I assume that should be. Oh, I'm not sure. I've never used one where you can drop in something and that triggers an event handler. I'm sure Node.js's API would have something like that, where you can trigger an action as soon as something comes in. I know they call it push notification on the front end. And I know in JavaScript, they call it the subscriber model, but I'm not sure within this specific case. I've never done that, but I'm pretty sure I can find something on Google.
So we have this notion of subscriber. So you're able to subscribe to our
okay. Feed. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then I'm pretty sure I can look up something and do something like that. But basically, it's going to be that. So with enterprises, we do something very similar, but with like when I worked with banks, what they do is they'd run a job every time.
Like a cron every 5 or 10 minutes. Yeah,
exactly. So I assume you guys want something similar.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, that's Javed's department, but yeah. And then how would you manage routing of the file? Like you get the file in, like if it has to go somewhere, you need to send the data. I mean, not the file, but the data. Like you're sending the database. Like how would you approach? Like where it's coming from, but and obviously there'd be a file naming convention of some sort.
Are we saving? So we're getting the file, and now I have access to the file through this cron job or whatever, which now triggers some processing, which is reading the file through a read stream, formatting and mapping it according to the way we want it in some sort of JSON or Excel format that our database can accept. And then we just call your database APIs. If it's MySQL, then there's a connector that MySQL can use, and then you can just pass it. This is the JSON object from this file, or this is the data object from this file.
And what would you do with the file, do you think, once you've finished with the file?
I mean, do you guys need the file? That's a business requirement question.
I assume we want to keep the file. I mean, we'd be using an S3 bucket, right? Like that's probably where we'd drop the file.
Well, yeah, you can use S3 buckets for files. Usually S3 buckets are used for images, but yeah, sure, you can use them for files as well.
What else could you use if you weren't using S3?
Honestly, we've never, so in my experience, we've never used files. Like if you've saved the data to your database, at most what you could do is you could save it to, if not S3 bucket, you could save it to anything like Google's. I did one project where I saved it to like Google Drive as well. And I saved the public link to that drive inside the database itself. So within the JSON object, you had like a URL linking you directly to the file, the CSV or whatever. So that could be something you guys could be interested in. So,
and how would you secure all of this? What's the security method? Because obviously this data is sensitive. What would you?
Well, you would want, if the file is coming from some sort of customer, then a customer would have some sort of customer ID, and that, so, and the idea is that if the customer is uploading the data to, like uploading the file to a secure SFTP server, they're managing security on their end. We have to assume that that data is okay, legitimate, no unscrupulous person is over there. That specific endpoint where they're adding that data is connected to some sort of customer ID, and we're using that to map their data there. So I would just be expanding whatever your existing infrastructure is, because I'm sure you guys are doing it that way, right? So unless you guys are saying build something new out.
No, we have all that. We have a auth built on everything. It's all the APIs are tokenized.
Yeah, exactly. So if they're tokenized APIs, then we shouldn't have. Yeah, like I'm sure you're already managing customer data in some way, so just do it that way.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of, say, Node.js, is there anything, when you think about the type of service we're trying to build, is there anything, in terms of Node.js that you would, in terms of that as a technology, would you think that's the most appropriate programming language to use, given what we're trying to do and the types of data and files that we're using?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted more performance, you could go for Golang. I've worked on that. That's, I think, like several times faster. Or even Deno.js, which is much more streamlined than Node.js. I think it's several times faster.
What's it called?
Deno, D-E-N-O.
D-E-N-O. And so what's the difference between the two?
I haven't used it. So I have used Golang. I've not used Deno.js. Okay. I know it's because of the number of libraries and the number of libraries that have skewed out of Node.js that does not really optimize the entire node. The NPM tree, dependency tree, is just massive. Right. So with Node.js, it streamlined quite a lot of that. So the amount of processing you have to do to get a certain amount of productivity, that's like a fact. It's many times more faster than Node.js.
Right. Okay.
I know Google
and Golang. What's the benefit of Golang?
Yeah, Golang, I was working at ANZ briefly, and I built their infrastructure for their SMS API. So which is the API that, in case, or for their push messaging API. So I just connected and built that out for them, 2 APIs for them. And with Golang, it's just built, I know it's built by Google, and it's a very, very, very fast, I think it was built on C, or C, really basic C. And it's really, really fast in terms of processing. So again, you don't have that overhead that Node brings, but it's just a completely different language. So I'm not sure if you guys want it, because you have.
Yeah, we need to be able to support the language, right? I mean,
exactly.
But still, I think I'm asking you because this is all good to hear you talk about it, because it's just just good to hear you talk about the stuff. So
I guess from a business perspective, you have to look at it. I think Node.js is performant enough, and I think you'll gain better performance figuring out your infrastructure, whether you want to pay for better performance or you want to go down the Lambda function route or some combination of the two. You'll get more performance there. When you get into stuff like, should I use Node or Deno, it's like your application is massively large now.
Yeah.
And now you're thinking tens of thousands of rows of data. Okay, so
Yeah,
if you're there and you have thousands of concurrent customers, then yeah, sure, then we can have this conversation.
yeah. I understand. Okay. And you say you've done some work with microservices, did you say before?
Yeah, so generally I've worked with both GraphQL and microservices, just standard REST.
And what do you think are the problems with microservices? What is sort of the downside to microservices?
How would I put the downside to microservices? I know GraphQL is just really flexible with the way you can call data in with their with the both in terms of speed of delivery and both in terms of how you write an API function. Writing microservices can tend to be tedious, whereas with GraphQL, you just need to understand the way the format of your call is, and then with one format and slightly tweaking the end parameters, you can get more different types of data that has built-in filtering, for example. So you can say, get me, if you have, for example, if you have a backend with documents, with 600 documents, and you want to apply a filter that get me data from this date to this date, then you can add that to the GraphQL object that, get me all data, but just date from to date to. And those filters are built in, but with a microservice, you kind of have to build everything. So it's very anal, I guess. With microservices, I guess that's probably the best way to put it. And with GraphQL, it's very flexible. So,
okay. And your, I guess then maybe a couple of last questions. How do you keep on top of like emerging technology? Like how do you keep your skills up to date? Like what's your approach?
I mean, given that I have a family now, it just the approach is whenever a business problem comes, you try to figure out the solution. That's probably the honest answer right now. I used to be on top of quite a lot of things. Now it's just whatever the job requires, we just keep on, because you don't have enough time in the day.
Well, so how do you know if you're writing good code? How do you make sure your code quality is always optimized?
I have like a prettier RC and an ESLint file like already in my VS Code that I have set up. So again, when you start a project, you figure out basic standards like basic stuff like indentation. Are we following ES5, ES6? Are we, what sort of standards are we following? Are we doing are we using TypeScript for strongly typed languages versus JavaScript, and we're just wooing it through it? Are we doing any unit testing or not? So those are the sort of questions you want to ask in the beginning. So if I were to join this project, then I'd just see how your existing infrastructure is, for example. And if it's already in prod, then at least maintain that standard, if not make it better. So, and obviously the first goal is to target an MVP. So, testing's great and all, but if it's a time press project, then the idea is just get something out the door first, and then you can build it up after that. It really depends on, how much time there is, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're pretty clear. I think Javed's kind of got a pretty clear understanding on his side of how much effort he thinks this is going to be.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
Where is Javed from? It sounds like a very Pakistan. Okay, and then he's from where I'm from.
Which part of Pakistan?
Lahore.
Okay. I mean, yeah, he's been here quite a few years, but I think he'll. I think, like I said, it's a pretty tight brief. So I think it's a nice tight set of requirements, tight brief to start, pretty quickly. But to your point, definitely, how do we get something, built and POC and MVP, whatever you call it, not POC, but something that we can build on, but quickly get something going, right? So that's solid,
I think I'm not sure who does so is Javed the technical person? The reason I'm asking is that when people say that their requirements are done, right? So you say your requirements are done, you know what you want, right? From a business perspective, right? But how you get there is always the problem. And I always say go POC first, because it might not be perfect, but in the middle, requirements will change, and you want to validate the fact that this is what we want. Is it even possible given our time, and what sort of restrictions come in the way? Right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then just get POC out of the way, and then obviously you come back, you pat it in, and who knows? By the time you get POC, you're like, oh, I don't want this. Maybe I want something else. So, so I'm making all my projects, like 90% of them end up that way, that are successful. And the ones that aren't is because they're like, no, everything has to be thought up, but then you're like, give me more time.
No, I mean, our philosophy is like, we obviously plan, we understand the requirements, but we start and then, in an agile way, right? Develop and build and improve and iterate and things like that. Of course, this isn't like a 28-page document that we're going to give to you. I'm just saying, well, the thing is, I guess we've got a well-formed idea of the problems we're trying to solve. We've got a pretty good idea of the architecture of how we want it to all hang together, the different stack, what the stack is that we want to use, that we think is the right stack that we know we can maintain and build on, and builds on top of our stack. So I think, so there's plenty of stuff to, I guess, for you to start working on, versus here's this idea, here's this vague list of stuff. Can you go off and build something? But let me